Late 2018, we did a webinar on trends in digital learning. This is the recorded version of this. Our webinars are fairly interactive experiences, so we don't actually record the live sessions. It means we can actually have a richer set of interactions as well. This was the first time we actually ran a webinar in the UK time zone, and that was actually really quite a really interactive session because there's just a few less people there. So, first of all, an introduction to me and Sprout Labs. I'm Robin Pettard. I'm the founder of Sprout Labs. What does Sprout Labs do? We essentially build digital learning platforms that help you also deliver and measure high-impact learning ecosystems. So essentially, the authoring part is our platform Glasshouse, delivery is Tatara Learn, and then measure is a new product that we're working on called Yield, which is to do with applying machine learning and AI to xAPI data. All of our learning ecosystem is xAPI enabled. Other content we produce includes the Learning While Working podcast. I make a couple of references to podcasts during the actual webinar session. Our blog, we've got lots of ebooks. There's also recorded past recordings of all of our webinars as well. And then there's a virtual Learning While Working conference. This happened in July, and it was about 28 hours worth of really fantastic talks by lots of great people that have been on the podcast. We're planning on doing this again in 2019 as well. Now, this is what we're going to cover in this particular session. Lots of material to go through, really quite tech-focused in its approach as well. When I was putting together these slides, I sort of reflected on the fact that for me, this is actually probably more technically focused than what I have done for a webinar for a little while. Tech sort of is that underlying thing around what we do in digital learning. It is the basis and foundation. And there are some things that have been changing recently in the way we use technology in digital learning. So that's probably why this has taken that approach. First of all, and quite often I do this as an interactive activity in webinars as well, exploring this idea that people do really want to learn. People do want to be better at their jobs. But quite often what we've been doing in L&D in the past is actually getting in the way of that by making digital learning focused on what people have to do, just focusing in on compliance rather than focusing on what people need to do and want to do to grow, to be better. Now, big thing about technology in workplaces is workplaces don't drive the adoption of new technologies. We drive the adoption of new technologies in our homes. A really good example of this is things like voice interactions with things like Google Home. These are things that are starting to emerge in our houses, but they're not in our workplaces yet. So it's this thing that quite often it's because it's simpler as a consumer to buy and adopt a new piece of technology compared to an organization adopting a new piece of technology. There's really good reasons for that. Technology needs to be robust and reliable before it's really used in an enterprise. So it just takes more time for things to trickle down. So there's also one of the frustrations quite often people have. They see lots of exciting technologies that they can use and buy, but they can't actually access those and use those in their workplaces. My big overall sentiment for this particular webinar, to give it to you front up in the recording, is digital learning is starting to change. We are becoming more focused in on what learners need. And this is quite a profound shift. Now, on to the first part of the recording. Bit of an odd session because there's a mixed bag of particular things I'm talking about. Some of the bits work together and there's a narrative that has to move from one topic to another. Some of them don't. So I'm going to jump straight in with actually probably the sexiest bit of technology, which is VR. So I personally used to work with VR back in the 90s. An actual fact that it was complicated, difficult to do, the technology was expensive, the experience was actually pretty average. I actually vowed to never work with VR ever again, and because of that complexity. It's actually interesting now that it's getting to the spot again where it's becoming easy and cheap because of new technologies, and it's just at that tipping point where it's starting to become usable. So Well, VR is not something that Sprout Labs does. It's something I'm personally starting to explore a little bit again. The thing from a learning point of view that I think is fantastic about VR is it's not PowerPoint presentations. It's an experience, and you literally get immersed in it. But the other thing to think through is it's not the whole experience. You need to sort of prepare people beforehand. They need to then have the experience, and then you need to debrief it. Some of the best examples I'm hearing of using VR is actually in face-to-face training sessions to bring in a more experiential aspect to the situation from somewhere else or something else. To give you a slight crash course in the different types of VR and to give you a sense of some of the possibilities and some of the things that people are doing is what I'm about to do. So first of all, it was actually in a conference last week. Someone sat there and went, wow, $200 for a headset? We haven't paid that. We paid like $2,000. At the low end, there's actually this series of headsets and technologies that are based on mobile phones. What you're seeing here in this particular slide is what's called Google Cardboard. And it's essentially a piece of cardboard, very literally, which a phone gets slotted into the front of it, and then the sensors in your phone, as you move your head around, then move back and forth. There's some of these that are actually also strap on, so you don't actually have to hold them up. Now, this is a great way to get an understanding of the basics of what VR is about. A Google Cardboard kit like this costs about $15. So if you want to go out and get a little bit of a sense of what's possible, that's the easiest way to get started. At the high end is PC-based headsets. These are $2,000 or $3,000. They give a really different set of quality and different sets of possibilities in terms of interactions as well. There's two types of VR, and this is one of those questions I always have when people start to talk about VR. I sit there and say, is it video-based or simulation-based? So this particular slide here is from a work experience simulation. Ben Ewing and Bernadette talked about this in the Learning Way Working virtual conference. So essentially, they were trying to give people, young people who'd never had experience of any workplace, understanding of how workplaces work before they went out on work placements. So essentially, they got a series of actors and then shot video in 360 degrees. So essentially, had a video camera that had multiple lenses on it, so it could take the whole aspect of it. So for someone entering this sort of space, it's a bit like being in a fishbowl. So you sort of have a spot in the room and then you can sort of turn around and look at what's actually happening. This is very easy to produce. It's essentially video skills, and this is what's sort of interesting for Ben in this particular situation, is because actually he was a video producer and writer, and the skills from video transformed into VR very naturally. So the other type of VR is simulated experiences. These are more like what you're used to seeing in a game, which essentially you have complete freedom to be able to move around anywhere in the space. These are more expensive to produce, but have a whole different level of ability to be able to build interactions because everything's calculated and simulated. If you can actually work in a way where you can use existing models of stock libraries, that does also make this cheaper. Probably one of the most exciting bits of technology for learning in terms of VR is actually augmented reality, which essentially this is the magic leap headset. What this does is actually literally layer a digital view across people's view of the world. Could be great for performance support. There's a fictional video out on the net that was produced quite a while ago. That was about a mechanic being helped and guided through doing a diagnostic and a repair on a car through the overlays. Still, Interestingly enough, this is a more challenging set of technologies and not quite got to that point yet where it's readily accessible, but I expect we'll be seeing more of this sort of performance support stuff happening in learning in the next 12 months. Now, classic Robin grid to do a bit of a comparison of what's happening between these things. I suppose it's the most important thing is the line down the bottom about thinking about, well, when could these things be used? Especially thinking about getting started with video-based VR. Some of the best examples I've heard of things like bank manager dealing with a difficult customer, essentially in a spot where that customer's got so angry that they're actually yelling at the manager. So essentially a simulated experience that's actually quite hard, quite tough on people, need to debrief afterwards. But putting someone in that spot is a powerful thing to be able to allow them to be able to really experience it and practice it. Now, a bit of a jump into data-driven approaches. First of all, people don't just learn in the learning management system. They learn in lots of different ways on lots of different digital platforms, outside of digital platforms as well. There's a technology that's emerged called Experience API, aka Tin Can, xAPI, which is what I personally abbreviate it to, that allows data to come into a learning record store from multiple different sources, so that you're not just collecting your learning data from your learning management system. It's coming in from multiple different spots. That's one side of it. And then the second side of it is just a really flexible way of being able to record learning data. Essentially, it works in a way where you record the actor, who it is, the verb, what they're doing, answer, experience, the object and place they're doing it, and then the result as well. Now, one reason why you'll see and hear people like Sprout Labs talk about this is because, to be honest, this is just a really flexible, easy, cheap technology to work with. It's still fairly complicated in terms of the fact that there's not a lot of off-the-shelf ways of doing things to get really powerful things, which is why it makes a good thing to work with a partner with. But it is just this really flexible, easier way of working than working with SCORM. Got to remember, SCORM is a technology that was now nearly close to 20 years old. Someone recently flinched when I said, "Oh no, don't use SCORM 2004," and she went, "What? That sounds like an old thing." I said, "No, use the older version, 1.2. And it was sort of like, okay, because we wouldn't be using a mobile phone from that era is probably the best way to put it. It's essentially an older technology. What we've actually started to now see is that it's a given. People want their ecosystems and they want their learning technologies to be xAPI enabled. It's no longer an extra. It's no longer something that people sitting there going, "Oh, gee, it would be good to have this." They're actually sitting there, they're doing a whole, "We need to have this is our future." Part of this sort of thinking about data is a bigger understanding in organizations and workplaces around data. Data's everywhere, and more businesses are becoming data-driven. One of the things I think that's important with that sentiment about the whole of organizations becoming data-driven is quite often in learning we focus on our learning data. We don't actually think about our other data that's out there and about how what we're doing in learning affects that other data, or how we can respond to that other data as well. So I think that's a really important aspect to actually sit there and do a little bit of a whole push and pull between the two to think through how those two things interrelate. Now, one of the best descriptions I've heard and discussions I've actually had about becoming data-driven was with Laurie Niles Hoffman on the Learning by Working podcast. Laurie's developed this idea of thinking about digital body language and reading employees' digital body language through data and asking questions about sort of what are people searching for, what are people looking for. We're talking about things outside of the learning management system as well. And then what are the trends and how is learning going to respond to these? Is there a particular change that's happening that's meeting there's a learning need in the organisation that L&D is missing? Because it's essentially about looking about all the other bits of the data in the organisation to get a read on those. The interesting thing with Laurie is she's not talking about xAPI. She's not talking about anything sophisticated. She's just talking about looking at data outside of the organisation to drive the learning experience. She's also interesting. The other thing about Laurie is she's actually not always just talking about it from the point of view of measuring impact. She's thinking about how the data can actually drive the learning experience as well. As well as the podcast, there's also a great recording of Laurie from the Learning by Working conference. She was actually our wrap-up speaker because she was in the UK, and that was the time that fitted best for her. And that was just a lovely set of material from her with a group of people who were very warmed up and had a nice level of interaction in that particular recording as well. So the other way of being data-driven came up in a nice podcast with Game Effective. Essentially, they came from a background of gamification of performance. They started to sit there and go, well, okay, if we're gamifying performance and measuring performance and giving people feedback on their performance data, what happens if someone's struggling? How can we help them? And this is where they start to sit there and go, okay, so if someone's got a performance gap in this particular area, what learning could match that particular performance gap? And that's sort of the powerful idea. And this was also the powerful thing was that essentially the learning components to be able to do this needed to be smaller. They need to be micro-learning experiences. This actually leads me into talking about micro-learning because it's a good example of the sort of types of learning experiences that micro-learning and working in smaller components can mean. For me, micro-learning is one of these examples of L&D starting to think about what learners really need. It's not that new. It's just actually thinking about what people need. And if people are learning in the flow of work and learning while working, then they need smaller chunks of learning. We are distracted for many reasons in our workplaces, and that then means we need smaller things to be able to access our learning experiences just in time. My definition of micro-learning isn't about sort of like 2 or 3 minutes or a particular format. My definition is that it's just actually small components of learning whose purpose is to change behavior or support performance. Notice I had a dual thing here because I think there is a dual thing happening with micro-learning. Learning is a process. Needs people to be able to practice and get feedback. Now, some of the most powerful micro-learning actually doesn't have any of those features. It's a micro-resource. It's a performance support, a job aid, a checklist, something that someone's accessing just in time when they're learning while working. And this distinction between resources and micro-learning is powerful for me because essentially the notion of micro-resources gives the power that you don't always have to have learning objectives, you don't have to have a full learning experience because people are grabbing that particular piece of content and using it in their job to achieve something and learning while they're actually achieving that outcome. Just a slight sort of few distinctions there around things, but I think that sort of gives a different sort of sense of one being a resource and one being a learning experience. In one of the webinars that came up, the idea that in actual fact a micro-learning experience might just be a daily reflection question or a weekly reflective question to trigger different types of thinking. There are some other trends happening in learning at the moment. Things like adaptive learning, personalised learning, spaced learning, and learning campaigns. These are all things that micro-learning enable. They're not micro-learning. They're actually things that you need your learning in smaller chunks to be able to use. So there's a strong link between these other areas and other trends back into micro-learning as well. Microlearning is maybe the bigger banner around sort of rethinking in sort of smaller chunks of learning, and then these are different ways that then microlearning can possibly be used. There's some real strong drivers for microlearning in our workplaces. We want to use our mobile devices more often, and essentially microlearning quite often, especially video-based microlearning, makes a great mobile experience. We want to develop our expertise faster, and we are getting distracted in our workplaces. Now, on that word of distraction, sometimes people talk about the idea that our concentration span is now more like a goldfish. Actually, I think that's pretty offensive to goldfishes. I actually have a vague feeling goldfishes are actually quite concentrated. I think the thing is, and I haven't been able to find any research that actually sits there and says that our concentration span is changing. What is changing is how much we have to juggle in our workplaces and how distracted we are. That distraction factor is possibly the real thing that's actually the reason why microlearning works so well, and the nature of the pace of work as well. Not so much this whole reduction in concentration span, but it's actually the nature of work. Now, quite often have this sentiment from L&D people who sit there and say, we want to increase knowledge sharing and social learning. And I think one of the most interesting trends that's happening at the moment is the rise of digital workplaces, where essentially collaboration tools are being put in place. And yes, I am talking about really good Office 365 integrations. So what's happened in the past is essentially a social enterprise platform would be put into place. And then you always struggle with getting people into it. With this digital workplace approach, essentially the whole workplace platforms become collaborative by their nature, especially if tools like Microsoft Teams are put into place, and then they actually use for team collaboration and teamwork as well. The challenge with this is collaboration doesn't necessarily mean people are sharing expertise, developing expertise together. So there's still a role in this space for learning people to come in to design learning experiences that go beyond just collaborating, to be able to be building new types of knowledge as well. On the topic of platforms, for me 2018 has been the year of the learning experience platform. Now, you're going to sit there and do a whole, what is the learning experience platform? I've decided essentially it's partly a marketing term for a learning platform that isn't actually a learning management system. So it's essentially a different type of thing that's not trying to be a learning management system. It's actually a new type of platform. But this is sort of the problem with it, because there's so many types of other platforms other than a learning management system that then become slightly confusing. So another couple of features of quite often learning experience platforms is that they're in a spot where people want things to be pulled in, so they're actually pulling them in rather than an organization allocating the learning back to them, is one of the big distinctions. I think this experience thing is possibly also really not a great word, because sometimes some of these platforms are very content driven rather than learning process driven. So there are ways of accessing streams of content or libraries of content more than anything. Also, they have a very different user interface experience that's a lot more modern than most learning management systems. The key to them is they're giving your learners some freedom. So rather than learning always being allocated to them or content being allocated to them, they can be in a spot where they can actually go back out and find and access what they need. Some of the features you might find is that they allow a learner to be able to put in their interests, and then for the system to either select existing resources from a library, or the other way that some of them work is that they actually have a flow and stream of content that comes in from the net and gets sort of automatically curated around interest topics that then go into someone's essentially like a Facebook page set up of flowing back in. The other thing is some of them do have the experience of being able to, features to be able to allow people to upload their own content and share content with their team as well, with sort of status update style things. But they're not primarily a social learning platform. They're primarily a way of consuming content. Now, in our own personal lives, we consume content quite often in a very different way. Picking on an example of a platform I use called Medium. Essentially, I subscribe to a series of topics I'm interested in. I then get recommendations via email every morning. I hardly ever use it on my desktop. I mostly use it on my mobile phone. She realised the mobile phone display was very plain and not particularly interesting, so I ended up doing a desktop version of this that looks quite different. But essentially, it's this constant stream of content that's around my set of interests, or what I've been reading in the recent past as well. One of the other platforms that it works in learning and can be adopted by organisations or individually that quite fond of, and it's a really good starting point to get a sense of what some of these platforms are, is Degreed. The great thing about Degreed is literally you can go onto the site and sign up for a personal account to get an experience of it. So if you're in a spot where you're thinking about, well, I really want to know more about what these platforms are, Degreed is a really good way of being able to experiment with this. Interesting enough, at a personal level, I've gone back to just using my inbox, email, and Medium rather than Degreed. It felt like it was essentially more focused doing it that way rather than using Degreed. If you're working with a team in an organisation, it might be a very different experience. Now, I hinted at this before. There's two types of learning experience platforms. The ones that are streaming in content. The Degreed is a really good example of that, or Curator and Filtered. And these quite often have an experience of being social. And then there's ones which essentially are more library-based. LinkedIn Learning, Skillsoft's new platform, and Good Practice are good examples of these. Some people might sit there and say, I'd be pushing it to call Good Practice a learning experience platform. It's more like just a library. But I'm doing this because essentially I'm thinking through in terms of the fact that these things allow people to be able to go out, find what they want, and then pull them back in. And these are great for just-in-time knowledge and supporting what people want to learn rather than being pushed in. Now, the thing is, how does your learning experience platform fit with your learning management system? A lot of people do a whole sensation of, well, our learning management system just doesn't give us what we need to be able to move forward to work with self-directed learning. This is partly marketing, because essentially, literally some of the marketing spills for the learning experience platforms are, you need more than an LMS. I wonder if you do. Wonder if what you actually really need is to be able to optimize and think about your learning management system in a different way, rather than being in a spot where it's always about enrolling and allocating people. Could you be setting up libraries of resources that people can pull in, access what they want to? So it's maybe more about an experience of working in a different way to rethink your learning management system, so it's less about allocating and more about people pulling in what they need. Now, underlying a lot of these platforms is a recommendation engine. So I talked about how essentially Medium was making suggestions based on my past reading experiences. So most of these platforms have some sort of smart system underneath them that's actually literally using artificial intelligence to make this happen. Now, this year, I've done a podcast series that will be released in early 2019 on L&D and AI. It's interesting. It's probably already out of date as I've recorded it, because it's such a fast-moving area and didn't even get to talk to all the people that I wanted to talk to. I'm just going to quickly talk about some of what this means. So here's a summary of Ruby's day. She's an AI and machine learning enabled L&D person. So she starts the day by looking at her dashboards and seeing that someone's struggling behind compared to other people, because essentially that person's behavior is different to the rest. She's seeing that there's particular content on their social learning platform that's highly working really well, and then there's another discussion topic that's not working so well. She's then working on the chat bot that helps and guides the orientation for the organisation. Now, when I dived into this particular set of podcasts, I didn't expect half of them to end up being about chatbots. And this is probably the big trend and the big takeaway, and the reason why I'm talking about it in this particular session is one of the trends is that chatbots are starting to be used in L&D. So we're going to dive into some of the uses of chatbots in L&D, some of the platforms and some of the possibilities. Essentially, as I was doing these interviews, I discovered that about half the people I was talking to were actually using a platform called Mobile Coach. Mobile Coach is not just a chatbot platform for websites. It also works with SMS messaging. The good example of this is leam Learning, and Emma Weber is working with Mobile Coach to build coaches that help people with learning transfer that are automated. Essentially, they do check-ins to make sure and see how people are going with learning on a regular basis. So it's essentially automating a learning process is the best way to put it. Then, if you actually want to have an experience of what a chatbot's like, and then also what a recommendation engine's like, I suggest you dive into Magpie. Magpie is a platform from Filtered. Filtered has combined together essentially three things. They've got a content library, a recommendation engine around that, and then the interface to that particular recommendation engine is a chatbot. So essentially, you go onto their chatbot, you are profiled about what you're interested in through being asked a series of questions, which is a very natural-like experience, and then you get suggested learning experiences. Magpie in itself is designed as a set of resources for L&D, and that's just a really good taster of what these sorts of things and possibilities are as well. I've sorted this notion of what AI is doing into two different areas. It's essentially affecting the learning experience, and then also how L&D is gaining insights. So, using these types of technologies, you can make predictions and understand data in different ways. Look at who's struggling, looking at what resources might not be working, looking at who's doing more learning compared to other people, or what clusters of people might be doing things. And then it can be used in the actual learning experience in three ways. One, personalisation to customize things based on what people are doing. Two, making recommendations, and then three, using chatbots to be able to customize the learning experience as well. Thank you for listening to this recording. It's quite a lot shorter than the actual session because of the lack of interactions in it. If you want to have a chat about improving your digital learning or getting started in digital learning, you probably have my email address if you've got this particular